lights.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Get in the
Go
light.
in the spotlight.
Get in the spotlight. Get in the spotlight. Well, welcome everybody, and especially welcome NewCat and anybody who's listening to us on NewCat. I'm Ruth Ann Webster. I'm the president of the League of Women Voters, and I welcome you. This is our third in a series of 4 events that have to do with energy awareness. And tonight's topic, and we've got Mark Lindquist here, a very smart guy. We've got Mark Lindquist here, and he's going to be talking about solar energy options. And I'm excited to hear about this because I think this is something that we all should be aware of and maybe take the lead. Before we get started this evening, I just want to remind everybody that our 4th and last series of the events that have to do with energy awareness is April 25th. And that time we're going to be talking about the energy efficient home. And we've got Chris Lewis and Dan Gobb from GSM to talk to us about energy efficient homes, and that should be good. That particular event will start a little bit early. We've been starting at 7. That event on April 25th, which is also a Thursday, but on April 25th, we'll be starting at 6:45. And the reason for that is that we put together a contest for elementary and middle school students to do an essay or a poster or something like that, and we're going to be announcing the winners at that time, and so that'll be lovely. So we hope that you can tune in on the 25th or show up on the 25th, because that would be a lot of fun. But without further ado, I think we'll talk about solar options and anything else Mark wants to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate the invitation. I've been involved in energy stuff in different levels of intensity since I was in graduate school, starting in about 1989. So this is some space I've been in and out of for 3 decades, I guess. And I'm just here to speak as myself. A friend of mine is on the league's board, and she asked me to come and present. And I said, well, what about Tim Zinnel? He's an installer and he's expert. And he's like, no, okay. So we'll talk a little bit about the solar that's at our house that my wife and I have done. We'll talk a little bit about, and some of the work will be informed by, or some of the comments are informed because my work currently is I do the building maintenance program for a state agency, and our agency has about 30 solar arrays that my team is responsible for taking care of. Now, I'm here to speak as myself. I'm not here to speak for my agency or my employer or anything else. So everything I say is my own opinion, perspective, and so forth. Any errors and omissions are mine. So I'm not speaking for my employer at all here. This is I'm just a guy here tonight. So, and last week, Derek Nelson from New Ulm PUC was talking about some of the city rebate programs, and there were some questions, and there was some comments about sometimes when you deal with salespeople, they're selling you something, right? So I'm just a guy, I don't sell anything. So with that, let's just go, and if I talk fast enough, hopefully there'll be some time for some conversation too. So at our house, we've got 3 kinds of solar. We've got passive solar, we've got a solar thermal air heating system for a chicken coop, and of course we've got a PV array. So there's 3 types of solar we do at our house. The cheapest solar is passive solar. We built this house in 2011, and really it's fundamentally about the orientation and shape. So the axis of the house is east-west. We don't have a very big house, It's well insulated. But for the most part, we have a normal amount of windows on our house, but they're all kind of, the glazing is concentrated to the south. So we tried to minimize the west. We actually had 0 windows on the north side of the house. The east side has a little bit more than passive solar designers would suggest, but I did plant a tree that will eventually provide some shade on the east. So it's the southern exposure that's really key in the winter in Minnesota to get some warmth from the sun. So actually you can see the other thing is just minding shade and shadows and solar angles. So we built the eaves and this little eyebrow here so that, you know, when the sun gets high in the summer, that this shadow is going to come down to the bottom of the window. And we're not going to get any direct solar heat gain in the summer. But when the sun is low in the winter, we're going to get lots of those. And it's also important to specify the right kind of windows. If you go to the lumber yard and just get a standard Energy Star window, it's going to have a low E coating, and it's going to have what they call a low solar heat gain coefficient, which means it's kind of designed for down south and air conditioning. So it's going to bounce all the UV light back out instead of letting it come in and warm in your house. So that's kind of it, and we put a garage on the north side of the house as a windbreak. So sometimes you can drive around out in the countryside and you'll look at people build houses, and they'll run the axis north-south, put the garage on the south, all the big windows on the west. So what they've done is optimize summer heat gain so they can spend more on air conditioning, and minimize winter heat gain so they can maximize their heating bill. So these things don't necessarily need to cost any more. It's just how do you lay things out? How do you think about it when you design it? It's a lot easier when you start with a cornfield and a brand new house. But you know, if you live in town, especially here in New Ulm, where our roads don't go north, south, east, west, it's going to be a little trickier to say how can I modify my house to do more. And then it means looking at your windows. Do you want to put bigger windows in parts and smaller windows in other parts and change out the kind of glazing you got? At that point, you're probably spending so much money and resources, it's just not going to be that interesting. So that's passive solar. I think, Deb, you talked about you in Colorado. You have you had an earth-sheltered home out in Colorado.
It would have been down in Iowa, but yeah.
Iowa. I'm sorry. I don't know why. Colorado and Iowa not the same, but you know. So the other kind of solar heat we have is this was a DIY project my wife and I did at a little workshop. We started heating our chicken coop because we felt terrible for chickens in the cold. Too soft. They would have been fine, but we felt we should. Although that may be why we ended up with 13-year-old chickens. But you know, it's a simple machine. It's got a hole in the bottom. Air comes in, fresh air comes in on the bottom. It warms and it flows up with convection, and then flow into the coop. And we could raise the temperature in the coop at least during the day by 20, 30 degrees. So it'd take the load off some of the electric heat we had in there that would be. So there's a huge technical potential for solar hot air, solar thermal systems. It's not really widely adopted. I think that's not a particularly pretty thing. And I don't know that we would have wanted to put that on our house, but, and so forth. But, you know, if you've got a shed, you got something, it might be the case. It's harder to find a dealer to do that kind of work for you, but you can buy products online. There's stuff for sale that's pre-made, and there's tons and tons of stuff if you want to troll around YouTube to find do-it-yourself solar air heating systems. You know, the conversion rate of sunlight to heat is really nice, and you can concentrate it and make some good things happen. But you know, on commercial stuff, I don't know if it's just I think the return on investment just wasn't very good, and people weren't very attracted, as well as cutting holes in the side of the house, and depending on the aesthetics. Like for our house here, there'd be no place to put it on the side. this spot here is like our kitchen and the stove, and that wouldn't work, so, you know, it's just, yeah. And then the other solar thermal option that's been big over time is hot water. And the further south you go, the more interesting it is, because in this part of the world, you got to make sure you don't freeze the water that flows through the system. You know, there too, there's a high technical potential, but low adoption rates in this part of the world. It's a little bit more complicated than heating air, because you need to keep water from freezing. It's plumbing, you got to manage the leaking. Although there's some advantages, like you can store heat in a big tank of water and then have it available for a night or some other time. That's actually a shower building at Split Rock Creek State Park. The DNR is installed, I've lost track, a half dozen to a dozen solar hot water heating systems in shower buildings. We've kind of pulled the plug on that, in that these are buildings that are operated with a load on that system for about 4 months a year, 5 months a year, and then they get shut down for winter. And then you've got this expensive system that's adding no value and so forth. And then there's also some engineering things about it. It's still collecting heat, and where do you put the heat when the building's not being used? But I do have a coworker who lives near there and helps maintain that site. He's got a similar system at his house where he's got a steady load all year round, and he loves it. It works great. But like solar hot air systems, it's a lot harder to find a dealer or an installer or somebody local who does that work. So you can find all the parts and pieces and do it yourself, but you'll have to work a little harder to find installers. So then the last one, and when we talk about solar, most people are thinking about photovoltaics. That's making electricity with semiconductors. For the most part, folks are talking about connecting it to the grid and using the grid as the backup. You know, photovoltaic is being deployed, of course, as you can see, even just driving around the countryside here at a residential scale, commercial, industrial scale, and utility scale. So my system is 6 kilowatts of DC, and Xcel Energy's biggest projects are multiple hundreds of megawatts. So and a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts, so small to big. And because it's panels and they're all very modular, you can scale it. But photovoltaics is where the panel costs have come down so much. The manufacturing, the processing of it's semiconductors, so as computer chips stuff is getting better, it's also leading knowledge in here, whereas some of the other equipment is old-fashioned manufacturing, fabricating, welding, connecting things in a way that we haven't seen the prices come down on the solar thermal systems. And electricity is one of the most flexible and dynamic forms of energy we can use in our house, and overall, in the overall economy, more and more of the economy electrifies and moves away from direct heat. So if you're going to do a project, and the framework for the talk was a little bit vague, so I decided the talk was if you're thinking about doing a project yourself. So that's the framework for tonight. So I came up with 5 basic things that you need to pull off a project. 1 is motivation, 2 is a resource, 3 is money, 4 is permission, and then I at the last minute added the 5th one, somebody to put the stuff in. And that could be you if you're good with electricity and wiring and all that. So why does it matter to you? If you're doing a big project, for a lot of ways, just understanding your own motivations will help you make an informed decision along the lines as you get to some place and you get to some point where it's like, I'm not sure, and then you can look and say, is it just, I want to make some money, this seems like a great way to make money, or save money, or I'm concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, or I'm concerned about energy security and resiliency, or I'm just going to stick it to the man, or some portion thereof of all of that. If you know what you want, that will help you move through decisions. So you need a solar resource. You need space that the sun hits. Whether, if you live in town, it's probably going to be your roof. If you live out in the country, you might have an opportunity, like we, to just take a piece of the yard. So right now, solar photovoltaic solar panels will generate about 20 watts per square foot. You know. So that will help you, we'll talk about that a little bit more, trying to understand how big of a system and how much space and what is the resource going to get. So then if you're looking at your site, the closer your site is to where your utility service comes in, the better, because then you get less wire runs and voltage drops and all that kind of stuff. But that's just an economic optimization. Southern exposure is a good thing. Ideally, the way they're designed, you want it facing due south. No, it doesn't have to be totally due south. And shade does not help your production at all. There's a couple of tools out there that are really great. One is PV Watts. It's on a Department of Energy website. It's an online tool that you can use to do a lot of tweaking and assumption checking and so forth. The other one is a lot more fun, and it's a great place to start, and that's the Solar Suitability app that the University of Minnesota developed. And that's this. You can go online. The website was there, and I have a handout people can take if they want that has some of these websites, or you just Google Solar Suitability app. And it'll give you this picture that's got LiDAR based models in it that looks at how things are sloped and where trees are and how much sun should be available at site. So last week at the forum, Andrea Becker from Turner Hall was talking about Turner Hall project, so I just picked Turner Hall instead of anybody's particular house. We all know where Turner Hall is. So you can see they got that big flat roof, a lot of access to sunshine. And so this is going to rate it as a good site. And it's going to tell you some information about how many kilowatts you would need to meet a certain production threshold, what that would cost you, and what a simple payback might look like. So we'll go through some of that math a little bit later, and then you can get a little bit more detail by clicking a report. So this is just a really neat screening tool, and actually we've used it at work to say, somebody wants to do a project in a state park, and they start scrolling around going, not unless you want to cut a lot of trees down. So, it's a great tool. And then you can use this to start narrowing down, and then you can use something like PV Watts to start getting a better dial in. So when you look at something like how much do I need, how much do I want, what the resource will do, each kilowatt of capacity you have in this part of the world is likely to produce someplace between 1,100 and 1,400 kilowatt hours of electricity a year. When I just put in like my address, it punched out what the standard assumptions, 1,300 and a little bit more kilowatt hours per year that it would generate. I did the math on ours, and ours is averaging a little bit better than 1,400 kilowatt hours a year per kilowatt. But PV Watts is nice because one of the things it will do is be able to tell you, okay, we assume the first assumption is we're facing straight south. But in New Ulm, very few houses face straight south because the roads follow the river. So you can tweak it and say, well, I'm going to be 45 degrees off south or east or west. And that will help you understand what that impact is. And that looked to me like with a standard New Ulm roof, you're gonna, just by that shift, you're gonna take a ding of about 5 or 6% production from this 1,300. So then the other thing you can start looking at is if you're dealing with your roof, the PV Watts you can say what's the tilt. So I'm facing south, then how much does that tilt? From being straight up and down to being flat. You know, and if you look and you say I got a standard Rambler with a 412 pitch, I'm at about an 18%. If I got a little steeper roof, like a 612 pitch, I'm at 26, 25, 27%. So those are kind of numbers you can plug into the PV watts and then get back a more detailed sort of estimate for what your house, your home, your situation will be. So a great resource out there is EnergySage.com. And they quoted DOE as saying if you're south facing and your tilt is anywhere from 15 to 40 degrees, in this part of the world, you're good to go. But there'll be some differences. And then, it does snow here most years, not this year. Last year it did. But if you've got a flatter tilt on that, it's going to shed snow less. I pushed when the installer did my project, he said, well, let's go with a 25. I said, no, how about a 35? And it used to be, the rule of thumb was you take 90 degrees and minus and subtract your latitude. So we're in that 40, so around this world, the old thinking was 45 degrees. They're backing that down a little bit. Some of that's a time of year thing. The flatter it is, the more you'll shift your production to winter. The high, the more perpendicular it is, the more you'll shift your production towards winter. So, how much solar do you need? Again, this is one of these questions, like, what's your motivation? How much do you need? What do you want to accomplish? And it also is going to be tied to how much your electricity consumption is. Right now, Brown County REA for sure has rules, probably New Ulm. I didn't dig enough in New Ulm PUC's rules. Most of the REAs and Xcel Energy will limit you in a net metering world to 120% of your annual use. So they'll look and say your last year or two you used this much. You need to size it. In the old world, you could go to 40 kilowatts when there weren't very many of these things. But all of a sudden, like rural utilities were going, if everybody starts going to 40 kilowatts, it's going to bust the system. This doesn't work. We can't do this with everybody. But that's kind of a limiting factor. So your consumption is one of the things that limits it, and that level of consumption might be also tied to your motivation to how big you want to go. So last week we learned that the average New Ulm residential customer uses about 650 kilowatt hours a year, or a month, which means 7,800 kilowatt hours a year. So if we assume that like 1,300 kilowatt hours per kilowatt of solar, you need about 6 kilowatts. The Minnesota Solar Suitability Application assumes 800 kilowatt hours per month is the average use, so that you're pushing 7.4. And bigger houses and bigger families often push 1,000 kilowatt hours a month, so they might be looking at a 9 to 10 kilowatt system. Now, as part of that resource conversation, remember I started out some of this conversation by saying a solar panel will generate a peak output of 20 watts per square foot. So if you want to put in 6,000 watts, divide 6,000 by 20, you need about 300 square feet of solar panels. So sometimes people want to talk about the number of panels, but it's just really important to talk about watts and kilowatts and so forth. So, and obviously the bigger you go, the more space you need. If you've got 10 kilowatts, you're going to need about 500 square feet of space to put your equipment up. And if you've got like 1,000 square foot garage and you want to put it on one half, you're pushing that. And a lot of times 1,000 square feet is a pretty big garage. So then it comes down to money, right? You need capital. Roughly the going rate for installed solar, rooftop type solar, is about $3 a watt. So that's assuming no structural issues. It assumes your roof can handle the load. It assumes that you don't have a 15-year-old roof and you're starting to go, should I re-roof the house too in order to put this on? We're just ignoring those kinds of things right now and assuming, yep, your roof's ready to go. You either put a brand new roof on or you're gonna need to put a brand new roof on, and now's the time to strike. There are also solar shingles out there that will replace your regular shingles. Tesla makes some of the big shingling companies have partnered with somebody and they make them. I think JF makes them. I don't know anything really about them. I've never been involved in a project with them, so I couldn't tell you costs or benefits relative to just doing regular panels mounted on racking. There is a 30% tax credit. The Inflation Reduction Act that was passed, in 2022, restored some of the tax credits that were starting to phase out and phase down. So this $3 a watt turns into $2.10 a watt with that 30% tax credit. So now that $18,000 project is $12,600 out of pocket. You know, you got to wait until you do your tax returns and all that kind of stuff, but it is a tax credit, not a tax deduction, so it just comes off of your taxes. If you don't have a big tax liability, there are some provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act where the Treasury can actually write a check instead of just take it off your taxes. I don't know how that works for individuals, and you need to take a good hard look at that, but for non-tax paying organizations like, say, local units of government, the EDA is talking about doing some solar. That's the kind of organization that can now take advantage of those federal incentives that historically they couldn't. You know, Excel serves some of the communities near us. I think Cortland is on Excel, Nicollet. There's a whole bunch of different sets of incentives with some of the investor-owned utilities, so that the financing can look a lot more attractive actually. But because of all those solar community solar gardens like you see when you drive down 14, it's sucked up all the capacity on the substations on the XL system, so it's a lot of XL service territory. It's really hard to find a place where you can actually have the capacity to get it on. You're probably better in the heart of Minneapolis than you are in the suburban fringes or rural fringes. So that's the kind of money you're looking at for doing a solar array. Then the next part of that is thinking about cash flow. If you stay under this 40 kilowatt threshold or 120% of your typical usage, you get to do what's called net metering or net billing. Basically, like at my house, there's 3 electricity measurements that are continually happening. There's a production meter for the solar array, so we know how much the solar array is producing. There's a meter that measures how much electricity leaves our property and goes into Brown County REA's system, and there's a measurement for how much electricity comes from Brown County REA into my property, into my house. And so then you can, you know, then they price it in different ways. So there's some weird utility, bureaucratic, government regulatory calculations in here that I don't even want to try to look at. But basically, New Ulm's rates right now are just shy of 12 cents a kilowatt hour. And just because of the quirks of how the calculation, any electricity you offset in New Ulm with your own solar array would be worth, you know, that 11.7 cents a kilowatt hour for you. And any that you sell back, at least this year, would be worth 12.7 cents to you. So, and Brown County REA has a little bit different, well, they have a similar pricing schedule. Their kilowatt hours are a little bit cheaper, but the monthly minimum fee or the monthly standard fee for Brown County is a lot higher. I think it's $42 a month for us just before you buy your first kilowatt hour. I think it's, 10 or 15 here in town. I looked it up, but it wasn't part of this calculation because that's a fixed cost and it won't, you know, change any of this. So when you look at that, your revenues are the value of the kilowatt hours produced, whether you use them on site or send them back to the utility. And then there is this grid access charge that happens. The utility said, hey, all these people are plugging systems in, and we're providing them services that they're not paying for. And there's a lot of grinding and discussion and wailing and gnashing of teeth up at the Minnesota PUC, and so they said, yeah, you can do this grid access fee. So for every kilowatt hour or every kilowatt of capacity you have in New Ulm, they'll charge you $1.75 every month as a fixed fee. Out at Brown County, I just did the math on my bill, it's about 85 cents a kilowatt hour. And those differentials, I think, have to do with the fact that the Brown County REA monthly fee is a lot higher than New Ulm. So it's accounting for all the same kinds of costs, the fixed costs of wires, transformers, all that kind of stuff. So, and then the other piece of cash flow is if you're not paying cash and you're borrowing money and financing it somehow, you got to account for your debt service. And because if you don't account for debt service, you're going to find yourself not happy. So if we take some of those numbers and start putting that into a cash flow, I just did a really, really simple 25-year cash flow. And I assumed no maintenance. I assumed nothing was going to break. And so forth. So, but that 1,300 kilowatt hours at 12 cents is worth about $156 a year. If you pay that $1.75 per month, that's $21 a year, net revenue of $135 a year. So you start looking at a simple payback of 15 years. Or if you say I want to compare it to different investment options, your internal rate of return is going to be someplace around 4, maybe 5%. So when we put our system in, we did the deal in 2019. Our bank accounts were like less than 1%. So we're looking at this, going, we've got some savings. Our cost of capital is super low. 5% return on internal rate of return was really good. So right now you could probably go and open a Treasury Direct account and buy 10-year Treasury bills or Treasury bonds, bills, notes, and be in that same rate without having to do a project. So.
Would it keep you warm?
Right, and that gets you back to your motivations, though. If all you're looking for is return on investment, you can probably find a better return on investment than solar. But if your goal is to save the planet or do your bit to save the planet, as it were, this is something you can do, and it technically doesn't cost you money. You can make a little bit of money and do a good thing, right? So understanding your motivations is part of that key thing. So. The next bit, how am I doing on time? All right, we're doing okay. Is permission. So you're going to need a couple of kinds of permissions. I said local unit government permission and utility permission. So local governments, whether you're in New Ulm or out in one of the counties, they do have zoning ordinances, and so you're going to have to look and see what's allowed. You'll need a zoning permit. Typically in New Ulm and out in the country, solar is generally considered a permitted accessory use, which means, yep, you can do it as long as you stay within the boundaries of the ordinance. For me at our place, the biggest challenge was the 100-foot setback from the county ditch that's adjacent to our property. I got it where I wanted it, but just barely. In New Ulm, I did read the ordinance, and it always bears double checking, but the New Ulm ordinance is an allowed accessory use for up to 120 square feet of solar. So when we go back and remember, okay, it was 20 watts per square foot, 20 times 120 is 2,400. So on that permitted use, you're going to be limited to about 2.5 kilowatts. And as we saw, that average customer needs about 6 kilowatts. It's not that you can't go that big, you just probably need to walk into conditional use permit land, which shouldn't be too hard. It's just there'll probably be an extra hearing, and if your neighbors don't like you, they'll come and yell and say it's gonna be ugly, and it's gonna blind them, and it's gonna da-da-da-da-da. If you get along with your neighbors fine, it'll probably just go swimming. So New Ulm does allow ground-mounted solar within its ordinances, but if you look around at yards and you start thinking about setbacks and the controls, most of us, you know, when we lived in town, there would be no way I would have ever even considered a ground-mounted. Technically legal, but the viability would be really tough. And again, outside of town, as long as you're staying far enough away from the road right away and drainage ditches, pretty much good to go. And if you're in town, you're also going to need a building permit. So cities will have two kinds of permissions. One is a zoning permit, a zoning permission, which is about the land use. Is this an acceptable land use for the place? Or is it going to conflict with the neighboring and surrounding land uses? And then the other piece is, does it comply with the building code? So the second part, the building code part, is a building permit. It's been a long time since I've lived in New Ulm, and I never needed a zoning permit, and I think I did about 3 projects that needed building permits. It's usually pretty simple. But this is all about making sure that your system is going to meet the code requirements for structural standards, and it's not going to fall down and tear apart and so forth. Neither Nicollet County nor Brown County enforce the building code, so whatever you want, whatever you and your contractor think is good. Although the electric code isn't, the electric code is enforced everywhere, and the state electrical inspector is going to come and inspect it. So the wiring's got to be spot on and all that kind of stuff. And then the utilities will have a permission. They have legitimate safety issues and concerns about their systems and equipment, and just having people plug any old thing into the grid can create problems. Even, you know, years ago we had some ice storms where I lived, and power was out all over, and you know, there was lots of stories about people unplugging the stove, firing the generator up, snaking the cord in through the house and backfeeding through the stove outlet. But they had nothing, so now they're energizing the power line back into the grid, so when the linemen are working on it, they think it's a dead line, but it may well be energized, right? So there's a whole lot of concern about not energizing stuff that the utility looks at and says, well, there's a power outage, we think this is unenergized. We don't want to hurt those people. That, you know, if you really pay attention to what the line workers do for utilities, they do a heck of a job. They do some really important work in really bad conditions, and yeah, we want to keep them safe. And you don't want to blow out the transformers and systems and whatever. So there's some basic technical requirements. I was having a conversation earlier before the meeting started, and somebody was talking about, in the past, utilities, and there was some of that locally. I don't know about the city of New Ulm, but some of the co-ops, and certainly XL was notorious for it, saying, well, if you want to hook up some solar, we better do a study. Oh, yeah, that'll be $600. Oh, it's a little inconclusive. We better do another study. That'll be $1,500. You know, and it really was sort of a technique to kind of. A lot of folks thought it was a technique to kind of kill off and keep folks that weren't super persistent away. 15 years ago or so, it's actually about the time I was working for a nonprofit in energy policy. The Minnesota PUC worked, you know, there was some legislation, and the PUC worked with stakeholders and established statewide standards. There's a statewide uniform application for interconnection and statewide technical standards. So the games, you know, aren't being played in the same way they were when we did ours. Zinno Electric did ours, and they've done a lot of them with Brown County, and it's like, yep, here's the form, sign it, yep. Do you have your insurance? Yep, good to go. I just said insurance. I didn't account for cash flow and insurance, so when we put our system in, called the insurance company and said, we're doing this thing. What, you know, is this covered? How do we do this? Do I need a rider? Our particular policy, our particular carrier said, no, that's an accessory structure. It's covered under your policy. Accessory structures are covered up to a certain point. It's like, well, I got a house with an attached garage and a pop-up, you know, Menards shed. So yeah, I fit well within that. The liability coverage was good, you know. But you may find that your insurance carrier has a different attitude. I don't know. Check with your insurance carrier. And if they say, well, gosh, that's going to cost you an extra, you know, $2,000 a year in insurance, that may kill your cash flows. So, anyways, those are some of the permissions. Those are the key permissions you need. Local government, utility. For the most part, doing small scale, residential scale solar, those things are not hard to do. They just need to be done. The advertising for tonight talked about solar and wind, so I don't do bait and switch on you. We'll talk just one slide. When I did my master's mini thesis, it was on what's the opportunity for small wind in the state of Minnesota. And at that time, that was 30 years ago, solar was so expensive it wasn't even worth talking about, except for in niche applications like calculators and, you know, totally off-grid things and whatnot. But when you think about a small wind turbine, if you live in town, I did look at the zoning ordinance, and there's a lot of permitted ability to put a wind turbine up, but by the time you meet a setback and a height restriction and a this and a that, it's just not going to be viable. And we're in a valley, and there's lots of trees and buildings and things, and so wind turbines like smooth flowing wind, and trees and buildings and all that make turbulent wind. So in town, just not an option. If you're out in the countryside, it's certainly potentially technically viable, and the ordinances in Brown and Nicollet County should be no problem to be able to install them. If you drive up Highway 5 over to St. Peter at about 111, coming up out of Nicollet, you'll see like 5 or 6 wind turbines just from that one vantage point. But the return on investment is a little bit more challenging. There's more maintenance to do. It's moving mechanical equipment versus just electronics. So there's different kinds of lubrication and maintenance and wear and stuff. And small wind prices, so wind energy has gotten a lot cheaper over the years, but not by making better, cheaper small wind turbines, by scaling the wind turbines up, by making them a lot bigger, by letting them reach into higher wind resources that are more steady and faster. So we haven't seen the kind of price decline per kilowatt of installed capacity in a small wind turbine that we've seen in solar. So, you know, if you really want to do it, at times I think about it just because I think they're cool, and then you just have to say my motivation is I think it's cool. It's a hobby, right? It's a boat on a stick. But if you're like, no, I gotta at least have a positive rate of return. I need to get my money back out of it eventually. Maybe not. So, but if you can't do either one of these things, are there other options? Are there other ways to participate? Are there other ways to contribute? Both New Ulm Public Utilities and Brown County participate, as all utilities actually do in the state. They provide for a green power purchasing program, so you can sign up and say, I want to have a certain amount of the power I buy come from a renewable resource, and I'm willing to pay for it. So it's not much. I think, so I looked a week ago. I think if you spend $1 with New Ulm PUC, they will cover half of your utility power with renewables. If you spend $2, it's 75%. If you spend $3, 100% of your your purchased kilowatt hours are coming from a renewable system someplace. Brown County REA works through Great River Energy. They have a little bit different. If you buy wind, you can buy it in 100 kilowatt hour blocks. We actually still participate in this. So theoretically, the power we don't make at home, the swapping back and forth we do, it's wind power theoretically coming in that we're buying to good, bad, or indifferent. You know, it costs us $2 a month, $120, or not, $1.20 a month is what we spend on wind. We buy 4 blocks. So if you want, say I don't like wind, but I like solar, you can pay a little bit more. There's interesting conversations about, you know, how effective these things are. Is this the best way? Is this not the best way? But these programs are regulated by the state through the state PUC, so that there is a renewable energy credit that's being generated and retired when you do that. So it's not being used for regulatory compliance. So all utilities are required to meet so much renewable energy, and it's moving towards 100% carbon free, but they can't take their regulatory requirement and then sell it to you and get an extra pop of money. So, and I don't know, are there other creative options if even that isn't interesting? You know, are you part of a group, a club, a church, or whatever, and say, hey, let's get a group together and do a project here. Let's put some panels up on the clubhouse roof, whatever, you know. So other options. I think there's a micro lending program you can go online. Is it called Kiva? I've looked at it, you know, and they do global development, and you might find some entrepreneur in Honduras needs to borrow $500 to put solar on their store so that they can keep the refrigerator running because they're in a rural place and they don't have electricity. And then you say, yeah, okay, I'll contribute $30 in a micro lending thing. And then theoretically you get the money back with a little interest, and you could, you know, so there's all kinds of different ways you could do that. And then the final option, and this is always the risk, I go longer and I say more things than I need to, is you need somebody. So how do you find an installer? There's a handout here if you're interested in that. You know, locally we got Zinnel Electric out of Morgan, Tim Zinnel, he did ours. He's got a good reputation. Green Energy Products in Springfield, they're a hero. Every time I've been to the New Ulm Home Show or the Farm Show, they come here and they market. They've been around a while. As far as I know, they're pretty solid. Energy Sage, that's a online tool you can look at. You can actually, like some of these other contracting websites, you can trigger and get quotes out of that site. You know, send my, you know, I want this, get me quotes. An interesting resource that I joined in poking around is Minnesota Solar Owners Facebook group. A lot of opinionated people on there, as you would expect on social media. So sometimes somebody said, I got a quote from this company and it doesn't feel right. And then 43 people will say, oh my God, run like heck. And then 4 people will say, they did a project for us and it was great. It's on budget, it's producing what they said it would, blah, 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 blah. And then somebody else will come in and say, hey, I can get you a quote, DM me on the side. You know, so it's just kind of a way to gauge some reputational cachet around different solar installers. And then there's other things like Minnesota Department of Commerce has some going solar stuff. Minnesota Solar Energy Industries Association, it's the trade association, they got their members. NABCEP, board certified installers, so if you go to their website, you can look and see who's taken at least the courses and training or tests that allow them to say, yeah, these people know what they're doing. So those are some resources. There's a little bit more on a handout up here that I have, you know. So the standard people, of course, will say get 3 quotes, right? If you don't have a contractor that you know or are comfortable with, and say, I'm just ready to do business with this person, getting multiple quotes is a good thing. So that's what I have.
Great.
And I think we've got, what, 10, 15 minutes? 10, 12 minutes, so if anybody's got questions or comments or...
The lifespan of well, sort of voltaic
The panels?
panels, yeah.
Yeah. So the,
Yeah, and how do you have to clean them? Do you have to maintenance?
excellent question. So usually people assume about a 25-year lifespan of a solar panel. They do over time tend to degrade a little bit. Their output will decline a little bit over time. Most of them will have a warranty that says it won't decline more than 0.5% a year over time. And, you know, so it's not like at 25 years, you know, sometimes you drive a car and you say, okay, I can get, in the old days we'd say 100,000 miles, and then 100,000 miles, you know, toast. Now maybe it's 200,000 miles and it's toast. They just kind of, you could probably get 50 years out of the panel, but its production would decline over time. So, but that's usually the operating assumption. If you're doing the planning for the project, it's about 25 years. There is one component, though, that may have a shorter lifespan. Solar panels make DC electric, direct current, and of course, you know, the grid and what we typically use in our house is AC. So you need to convert that DC power to AC power. And there's a box, a piece of electronics called an inverter. And those inverters are typically warranted for about 15 years. So then you might be looking at, okay, is that a component that's going to fail in about 15 years? So when I did a cash flow, I ignored that. I pretended they'll last 15 years too. At work, you know, there's inverters. Some can be micro inverters, so there's one inverter for each solar panel. Sometimes there's a big box that will do the whole array. And there's different technical reasons for choosing different options, but we bought a bunch of products at work or had them installed, and that manufacturer had a rough go. And one of my team was like, yeah, I got another warranty authorization here. So, you know, we swapped them out. Unfortunately, a lot of times those warranties are for parts only. So we had to eat the cost of the installer swapping them out. So that is a risk, and that's a reality. Some of them you might find that, like I had one, it looked like maybe the inverter was going bad early on. You know, I called Tim, I looked at it, and I went back and looked at it again. Oh, wire was loose. So, you know, plugged it back in and it was good to go. So like the micro inverters on mine, I might just be willing to do that myself. It looks like it's pretty close to plug and play. So, but you know, that's a comfort level with which you can do.
And do you have to wash it?
I have occasionally in the last couple. So I live not far from a gravel road. It's a relatively busy gravel road. There's a lot of hog barns on my road and a relatively large number of people. So we've had droughty years for the last couple of years, so the roads have been particularly dusty. And I've looked at it, and it didn't really make any difference, but I was just like being anal and uptight.
Just hose them off.
You probably would want to throw some Dawn dish detergent on it, but by and large, like now, if you get normal rains, that will typically keep that all off. There's you know, if you want to find interesting conversations in this group, it's should I clean the snow off or not? I tend to go out and do mine because it's like, you know, I work from home now, and it's like, I'm tired of looking at a computer. I'm going and getting my foam brush, and I'm going to see if I can get some of that snow off. You know, if you were going to pay somebody to do it, like at work, you'd look at it and say, yeah, the cost of labor versus the additional electricity isn't going to be worth it. Maybe if you just get a little peaks of some corners so enough heat can get down there and start generating a little bit of current in that panel, then it will start sloughing off.
Do they get warm?
They will warm up a little bit, yeah. because there's a current flowing through them. It's not like they're hot, that, you know, you can touch them and they're not gonna be hot or anything. They're also dark colored, so the sun shines on them and warms them up that way. So,
And you guys, you have them on the ground, not on your house, right?
yeah.
And how do you manage the flora and fauna underneath?
That's mine. I have wood chips under mine, actually. I have a colleague, a member of your board, who's like, wants to see native plants everywhere. It's like, let's put native
That
plants.
was a plug for her.
And that's a choice. I've got like 5 or 6 acres of prairie around this array. And it's like, well, yeah, that 20 by 15-foot space isn't going to be the make or break for the habitat value on my property. So, but it's like if you're doing a megawatt on 10 acres, where if you can put pollinator vegetation under there, now that's starting to be pretty meaningful. And my fear is if you start having vegetation under there, and I've seen it at work, then it doesn't get managed. And then that little tree sapling that was like this, that we ignored, and then it's like this, and we kind of ignored it, and then, you know, I don't, you know, no trees underneath. And then we do manage the grass around that with fire, and so less vegetation underneath is from my point of view, good, but it's all how you want to manage it. If you consider it a garden, you know, go for it.
So Mark, when do you think it would be economically feasible to actually have like a storage battery?
Yeah.
Where you can actually store the energy that's generated by the solar panels and use it, you know, at a later time instead of just using it currently or selling it
It's-
to REA?
It's getting closer and closer, and, you know, it's kind of a motivation thing there again. And so my wife and I talked about it on the security. You know, when we lived down in Worthington on the Nobles County REA, one fall we had an ice storm take our power out, and it took them 2 days to get it back. All the poles for a mile each way from our house were knocked down. They got the power back on. I can't remember if it was exactly the next weekend or 2 weekends later. We got an ice storm, and all those brand new poles got ripped down. And that one took 3 days before we got power back. And I was one of those guys going crazy trying to find a gen set on the back of a truck coming into the farm store. And some poor electrician came in, just like hadn't slept for 3 days and wired my gen set up. And, you know, so it's like, well, you know, that becomes part of the value. Is it about, because actually the thing that is important to understand is, this doesn't provide any backup power for us. So we need utility power telling the inverters that it's okay to send power out if that utility power isn't
Well,
there.
and it doesn't help for the demand of the power companies to have the capacity for peak generation. You know what I mean? It just provides, you know, some little electricity coming in, but every utility still has to have
Yeah,
the capacity to, you know, power up
Yeah.
on some day
Yeah.
when it's 103 and everybody's got their air
Yep.
conditioner.
yep. And, you know, there's a lot of thinking about how to manage the whole grid right now.
Right.
And part of that is starting to get to be batteries. So I used to track stuff at the PUC a lot closer because that was what my professional job was. I don't do that anymore. Now I, you know, worry about shingles and windows. But, you know, so if you've been listening to the news, Xcel Energy has proposed a new rate structure that's a time of day rate structure.
Oh, right.
And it's not that they were necessarily wanting to, but there was some push by other entities to say you should have this, it's more economically efficient. And then you start saying, well, if there's a time of day rate, I can put batteries in, and if we've got the right kind of controls, then we can tell the battery, oh, you know, at this time to this time, drop power, this time to this time, suck power up. and then you can start smoothing all those curves. So that's an economic viability that's coming. And there's other ways to store energy. So if you're on REA's been doing energy storage for forever. And the big way is you got these big 100-gallon water heaters that are designed to heat the water good during off-peak, and then you ride through the day until the next night. And all of a sudden you could start saying, well, instead of just firing them up at night, you could fire them up also from 10 to 2.
Where's that system?
What's that?
You said the REA has that, where's that located?
In everybody's house.
Oh.
So you have, you as a customer sign up for off-peak water heating,
Oh, I see.
and you get this great big water heater
Oh.
that's super insulated and bigger than the standard water heater. And then they would heat, the goal was to heat it up at night when they had all this extra coal-fired capacity that they weren't using. And then they could use that at night, and then you could coast. And there's ways to use those kind of technologies to account for the variable production of wind and solar. But wind and solar is very predictable. We know when the sun is going to rise. We know when the next eclipse is for the next 1,000 years. These things don't surprise us. The weather changes a little bit, but we can predict that pretty well for next hour, next day, next week. So utilities can plan. And so that becomes part of where the battery concept starts making more sense. We're probably not there. California has so much like rooftop solar. They talk about the duck-shaped demand curves, whereas the sun is starting to go down in the late afternoon, and people are coming home from work, firing up ACs and firing up stoves and stuff. It creates a real pinch point in California right now from about 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. After about 8 p.m., the demand is already tailing off, and their system is good to go. So it's like that 3-4 hour window where if you had some batteries, you would be able to take some of that extra power from 10 to 2, shift it down just a few hours later, and just coast smooth through. So they're changing their net metering, their kind of rooftop stuff to account for that. Minnesota has about 3 or 4% solar penetration, so we're nowhere near that yet, but it's the direction. So are we getting the hook?
This is fabulous. We could stay here for another hour. No, serious, at 8:01, the library staff comes and boots us out. So
Well, rightfully so. They get to go home, right?
They get to go home. They get to go, well, thank you. And,
Thank you.
Thank you. This was really fabulous. And don't forget that on the 23rd, starting at 6:45, we're going to be talking about...
25th.
What did I say?
Third.
Right. On, what's this?
The 25th.
Okay.
6:40.
Our next time is April 25th. It's a Thursday, 2 Thursdays from now. And Chad Lewis and Dan Dowd will be talking about energy efficiency. Oh, and they've done it. Well, let's get
And if you want any of those websites that I mentioned, I got about a dozen of these pieces of paper. And there's some on just general energy efficiency resources too.
Interesting presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, very thorough.
Well, hey, Glenn.
Thank you, I made it.
How you doing?
I'm doing good.
Good.